Everybody for coming. I'd like to think that the audience that listens to me are some of the finest people in the world and some of the smartest. Is that right? Well, so we agree. I'm going to start out why I got interested in UFOs, basically, other than seeing them as a child in the Air Force when I was flying. That's me when I was a little bit younger, flying tankers over England. We were told that the fighters had a bad habit of not coming back when they chased the UFOs, and they thought that it would be safer for the tankers to chase them away because we didn't have any weapons on board, and they didn't seem to return the fire on anybody who only if they were attacked would they return the fire. In any case, London Control picked up a UFO while we were over the sea just off the coast of Norfolk, and asked us if we would actually intercept a bogey that was about 1,000 feet high and over the center of England. It was about here over Stonehenge area. And we started descending down to some 1,000 feet. We're up at about 33,000 feet, and as we flew down, we passed the red line in the aircraft, which means we were going too fast. We had to slow down. And I often wonder if crews chasing UFOs often exceed the speed limit, so to speak, and destroy their own aircraft, because it's an exciting situation. Now, on our radar, we picked up a huge radar return out about 50 miles, and if you take off from England, one of the largest radar returns is the Firth of Forth Bridge in Scotland. And this is a picture of the bridge. It's about a mile long. And the radar return from the bridge was almost exactly the same as the radar return from the UFO over the center of England, except that it was flying, which gives you an idea of the size of the craft that was there and why they wanted us to chase it away, basically. It was over Stonehenge area, Oxford, Stonehenge area, just kind of floating around there. It's interesting, at that part of the world, on the ground, there's what's called curses, which exactly match the shape and size of the UFOs, or the motherships. This is about what it looked like, only it was off in the distance. We saw a bunch of lights on it. It was actually at night. It looked like a cruise ship at sea, or an aircraft carrier or something like that. And as we got about a mile away, it went up into space, pretty much like the shuttle launches at night. And apparently it looked something like this, actually in space. This is a drawing, so to speak, of it. The interesting part of this is a couple of weeks after we had landed, we got an invitation to a dining in with Prince Philip as a speaker. And Prince Philip asked to see the air crews and sit with the air crews, and we sat around with those who had chased UFOs telling our stories. And I told Prince Philip pretty much the story I just told you, and asked him why he was interested in UFOs. And he said that his uncle, Lord Mountbatten, had seen them up close in Asia, and that because his uncle had seen them and believed in them, he himself believed in them. And because he believed in them and Earl Mountbatten believed in them, I believed in them. Now, what's interesting about this is that, in other words, I had it confirmed, besides seeing it and having it on radar, when two of the great men of the world are convinced that UFOs exist, that convinced me. Now, NASA satellite photos also see UFOs. I don't know if you're aware of this, but this is a NASA satellite photo of pretty much what we saw, and this is taken from space. And seeing this photo got me interested in the fact that these UFOs must come from somewhere. Well, one of the likely places that they come from is Mars. And so we started looking at satellite photos from Mars. Now, when we checked with NASA and some of the top people there, they said that images do not show evidence of anything living or formally living on Mars. And the pictures you see that look like people or animals or plants or buildings or whatever are misinterpreted. They're just kind of light or projection and two-dimensional. In other words, NASA says there's nothing there. So I'd like you to consider that in my briefing, that NASA and JPL feel that there's nothing significant on Mars. Now, I didn't do this by myself. I didn't evaluate all these thousands of pictures by myself. This group of men and others have done a great deal of the work, so to speak. And much has been sent to me by Dr. Tom Van Flanders and Dr. John Brandenburg and Sir Charles Schultz and Norman Bryden and Richard Buckley. And the group goes on, and Joe Skipper and so on. Yes. Can they center the slide at all? There's a problem there?
Yes. Yeah, it's all cut off on the side there.
Do you know why?
You just go ahead. I'll try to fix it for you.
Okay. Well, in any case, there's a lot of people that have looked at these images on Mars, and you can go on your own home computer, so to speak, and look up Mars and JPL and the European Space Agency. In any case, the images are there, and you can look at them. And these are what we consider some of the most interesting ones. Mars, of course, was formed about the same time that Earth was, some 5 billion years ago. And we'll catch up with some of the slides, but the Hubble telescope is actually picking up planets being made, so to speak, right at this time. And Mars is very similar to Earth, but it's much smaller. Thank you. In any case, here's the protoplanet, so to speak, essentially at this time being formed, and the size of Earth versus Mars. As you can see, we're much smaller. Mars has about 38% of the gravity of Earth. So anything coming from Mars, taking off from Mars, only needs, you might say, 38% of the propulsion capability. Now, Mars goes around, so to speak, and comes as close as 78 million miles and as far out as 378 million miles. And people don't think of it, but planets all through history for millions of years have been hit by meteorites. And it's not really safe in the, so to speak, on Earth or on Mars. And Mars particularly has lots of problems because it's near the asteroid belt. And there's two moons on Mars, Phobos and Deimos. Fear and Terror is the actual name. Mars is kind of interesting that it has the largest volcano in the solar system. Maybe in the universe, but we don't know what's exactly out there. But we do know there's some 1,200 planets outside of our solar system. And here we have Olympus Mons, which is 88,000 feet tall, much higher than the mountains all around Earth. And here it is again. It's some 30 miles wide. And this shows the sun, the Venus and so on, and Mars. I don't know if you can see Earth and Mars and the asteroid belt and Jupiter. In any case, they feel that there was some kind of an explosion on the asteroid belt in the past, and they have evidence of that at Saturn with this bright area on the moon Lapidus. And on Mars itself, there's indications of a huge explosion, and even to some extent to one on Earth, that it's not really safe in their solar system throughout history. This shows you some of the deep valleys that occurred there, the Valles Marinas Canyon hit by a moon or an asteroid. It's some 2 to 8 kilometers deep, and it's 5,000 miles long, or 5,000 kilometers long. One thing interesting about Mars is that when these meteorites hit Mars, they bounce some off into space, and this is one that came to Earth, and it's thought to be 4.5 billion years old, and it has organic matter in it. It has microfossils indicating that there was life on Mars as long ago as 4.5 million years. Not only was there life on Mars, there was a huge ocean. Roughly half the planet had ocean on it, Malacandrian Ocean. And this is a map of the elevation showing the area where the ocean existed. Now, one of the things that happened to Mars is there's about nuclear holocaust about 180 million years ago. And they don't know exactly what happened. There's no real deep holes on Mars indicating that was a natural phenomenon. It was more likely a war on Mars between civilizations. It's kind of interesting that the aliens who come here keep on warning us against wars, nuclear type particularly. And one of the things they found about Mars is that it's very cold, like you've all always heard, but what you probably did not hear, that in the summer the temperature gets warm. It gets up to 81 degrees or so on the soil. Consequently, during the summer, liquid water can flow. Going back to the turn of the century, about 1890 or so, the astronomers got their new telescopes and they're looking at Mars and they're making drawings of what they see there. And Schiaparelli, the astronomer from Italy, decided that he could see canali. And this was interpreted as canals, and people around the world felt that there was canals on Mars. And possibly there is. We'll show something that could be called canals later. An American, Percival Lowell, wrote a book about Mars and told people that there was canals on Mars and that these canals took the water from the poles and moved them into the cities on Mars, and that there were in fact cities there. But since then, scientists have said that that is not a fact. But there's some indication that maybe there is cities there. One of the things that we find on Mars is a lot of craters from the meteorites from the asteroid belt hit the country and hit the Mars land's surfaces. And this is one that's kind of a crazy one. It's a square crater. It's thought that maybe somebody did some digging and made it square. Another interesting thing is there's plenty of pyramids on Mars. Here's one right next to this crater, and then you can see it blown up there. We also have craters that have bullseyes on them, one next to each other that look like a bullseye. Now, this gentleman is an acquaintance of mine, Dr. Gilbert Levin, is believed to have found life on Mars. Now, you probably didn't hear about it, but he devised some experiments to take to Mars with the Viking landers in 1976 that would test for life. And basically invented this highly sensitive method and called the label released experiment. And what they would do is squirt a drop of radioactive food into a tiny cup of Martian soil and monitor the air above the soil to detect the radioactive gas. In any case, the radioactive gas detected microorganisms on Mars at two places, two Viking landers, 4,000 miles apart. He stands by his discoveries that life exists on Mars and did in 1976. And he's even more convinced that, in fact, it was there and found. Now, science had trouble with coming up with a concept that there was life on Mars and kind of said, no, there was some kind of geological problem or whatever. There was many excuses made, but Dr. Levin and his people stand by the fact that they found life on Mars. Part of the way to show that there was life on Mars is to look at some of the Viking lander images. For example, this one is a Big Joe, and it has moss on it, kind of an algae and moss and so on growing green. Now here's a Hubble telescope picture of Mars in February. And if you notice at the top there's the North Pole, and it's quite large. Well, as the seasons go on in the spring and so on, the pole melts. At the time that it melts in the spring, Mars starts turning green. You can get out with your telescope and see this. Every spring, Mars turns green, so to speak. And that's this moss and algae and other vegetation growing there, which would indicate life, obviously. Here's a close-up of some of the moss growing. And we have melting of the ice, and we're not sure exactly what these are, possibly trees growing or just the melting of the side of the ice. Now, one picture that we found on Mars was actually found by Dr. Buckley. He found, and this is on the Google Mars. You can go in your computer and go on Google Earth and go into Views and go onto Google Mars, and you can find all kinds of fascinating things on Mars yourself. And this particular one shows an area 55 miles long showing some kind of track on Mars, like a vehicle was on there. And we have seen what appeared to be vehicles. And here's a close-up of the track, maybe turning around. Other tracks. And this track, if you notice, goes to what appears to be a bridge way over here. And here's a close-up of that bridge going across some kind of a chasm. A lot of these markings lead to an area called Cydonia. And Cydonia is famous, that probably everyone here has seen pictures of Cydonia, at least the famous face on Mars. He's up here in the right-hand corner. And that would indicate that there's some kind of life there, that somebody built in the distant past this picture of a person that looks kind of human. I've seen a few people out in the audience kind of look like this guy. In any case, here's another shot of Cydonia area with the face on the right, a place called the Fort, and here's the Fort. There's several pyramids in the area, and we suspect, but we don't know, that this area was hit by some kind of a nuclear weapon, and maybe that's why it looks a little bit old and in bad shape. In any case, that's an area that appears to have been a city at one time, or at least some kind of a religious area. Here's the face that most of you have seen up close. And it does show, you know, two eyes, a mouth, lips, even some teeth. Now, there was a lot of problems about this, and NASA didn't like the fact that people were saying they saw a face on Mars, so they took another picture of it, and it's not a very flattering picture. And any case, they say it's not really a face at all. But from the angle that it's taken and so on, you really can't tell. Now, a friend of mine, Dr. Tom Van Flandern, who unfortunately has passed away, worked at the U.S. Naval Observatory, and these are his conclusions regarding the face, that the natural origin hypothesis is disproved at odds of 1,000 billion to 1. It's pretty good odds. Artificially, the artificiality of Cydonia is established beyond a reasonable doubt. I think his conclusions are correct. Now, I'm showing you a lot of images from satellite, and in the Air Force I got used to looking at them. These images are 3 pyramids in Giza in Cairo, Egypt. And in other words, you get the same similar idea of what the pyramids look like from space. Cairo, interestingly, means Mars. And it appears that the Egyptians feel some connection with Mars. And I think maybe we all have some connection with Mars. This is the pyramid near the face of Mars, and it's 1.25 miles high. Obviously, their pyramids are much larger than ours, which run about 80 stories high. Another view of the D&M pyramid. They're very similar to pyramids in Mexico as well. The pyramids of the sun and the moon, and not far from Mexico City. Now here's another view of the Cydonia area, and we have this another face that looks kind of like the Egyptian Ramses. In any case, we'll see a lot of faces that look similar to Egyptian faces, and wear Egyptian helmets similar to what they have on Mars. Here's a picture of the fort. It's thought to have been a fort in the past. It's given that name. We have a hexagon crater in the lower left side there. And I don't know if you can see it, but what we often find where there's interesting places on Mars, there's also writing. I don't know if you can make out the writing there, but for whatever reason, the letters E and Y and Z and G and so on that we recognize as, English writing are often seen on Mars. Here's the crater seen up close, the hexagon crater. There's no natural reason to have a hexagon for a crater. So it is odd in itself. And we're comparing, you might say, natural formations against man-made or Martian-made formations. One of the things they've done, particularly the Soviets, sent in infrared satellites that could detect heat. And these satellites detected heat in various places in Mars. Also, right over Cydonia, underground, there seems to be heat coming up, which would indicate that there's some kind of life or furnaces or something going on underground. Some kind of heating is being shown on our infrared satellites. Again, the shot of the D&M pyramid, and we're not sure what these are, but they seem to be some kind of a structure and not natural. Now here's a close-up of the South Pole, and as I mentioned before, it melts. So there's indication that the Martians realize that there's melting going on, and they have to capture the water. So this is a crater near the South Pole. And I don't know if you can see down here in the bottom, but there's like a dam, and the dam collects the water coming off the side of the crater. There's a lot of water underground, a whole underground system of water and oxygen, it flows down into the bottom of the crater and is collected and pumped out. Then it's put into huge tubes. And some of these tubes are hundreds of feet wide, wider than football fields and so on. And the tubes are move generally from the poles, away from the poles toward the equator, apparently carrying water and possibly being a transportation system. I'll show you a series of these tubes, and they're made in different ways. But I had this particular picture that was kind of startling, and I called JPL, and I said to the gentleman that was in charge of tubes, so to speak, what were they? And he said, well, they're sand dunes. And I said, well, I spent 3 months flying over Saudi Arabia, anywhere from 50 feet to a few hundred feet, and I've seen thousands of miles of sand dunes, and those don't look like sand dunes to me. That sand dunes look more like waves in the ocean. The wind blows and it creates this wave effect in the sand dunes. And they're pretty much standard and parallel to each other. And these are changing directions. And the wind blows the sand dunes, causing the appearance. And this is changing direction in multiple directions, and it just doesn't make sense that the wind would blow, first one way and then the other. In any case, I don't think they're sand dunes. He got very angry at me. I suggested that he get in a plane and fly over some sand dunes, and it might be helpful. There's lots of different ones here that we'll show you. There's quite interesting, and I don't think they're natural formations. That's my decision, and that's Joseph Skipper's belief as well, who actually gave me this particular photograph. I think if you got inside these tubes, this is about what it would look like. This happens to be in Corinth in Greece, but this gives you the general idea that there's probably water moving through the tubes and probably boats of some kind moving over them. And then as they get further north, there's indications that underground cities exist. Some is on the surface, but not everything. Here's a broken tube, and they also spread out and go underground, almost like something like subways or railroads, that. And this one looks like it has light shining up through it, or else light is from the sun is bouncing off of it. We're not changing here. We're having technical problems. We're not able to change slides. I don't know what's the problem. My slide changer. You can look at this tube rather close and imagine some kind of a subway being inside of it, and trains or whatever, or even automobiles, that kind of thing.
Do you have an estimate of the size? There you go.
The average one is 200 foot wide, about 200 foot diameter. But many, in certain locations, become much larger, 300, 500, 600 feet in diameter. And some, like this one, this is one of the largest one, is thought to be 2 miles in diameter. In other words, you could put a whole city underneath it, or at least a large town. I guess we're okay now. Oh, well, I'll go back. Okay. This is the channel, the train that goes between the English Channel, but I just like to show you that it's a similar type construction effort that we feel that the Martians had made, and that trains are likely to run in these tubes as well. Here, we're back to that one. And this is the large tube that's up to 2 miles wide. And this is the tube. A lot of the tubes you can't see, you know, they're running underground, and for whatever reason, the sand blew off of them or whatever, but they show. But they definitely show, you know, roundness and seem to show something inside of them. This is an artist. Matter of fact, I made this drawing. That's that's my artist rendition of what they're like. Now here's you can barely see them on this particular one, but it shows that these tubes are throughout Mars, and that the astronomers 100 years ago were probably seeing these tubes and calling them canals. In a way, they are canals. And that some of these tubes join into what we'd like to call cities. Particularly about 30 degrees south, there's a whole series of city-like structures like this. This again shows a crater with water coming out of it. That's fairly common, that you find these craters with this water system that's running under the surface. And there's a lot more oxygen in the land that's generally realized. Also, there's actually flowing water on there. This ecostasma comes from the North Pole and appears to have flowing water in it. This is a European Space Agency picture, both the last one and this one, and this is a close-up of it. And within the red arrows, it shows water actually flowing. And then nearby is some moss or vegetation, a kind of green area here. And I don't know if you notice these perfect circles look like metal. I'm not sure what they do, but they would indicate some kind of life on Mars. Somebody built something along the way. Another European Space Agency picture that indicates water on Mars. And another European Space Agency picture. If you notice, they seem to be more willing to show water on Mars than a lot of the release that NASA has. Their satellite also has more color than ours. Now we are sending up new satellites, so we'll probably get better pictures. Again, possibly trees growing. We don't know what the vegetation looks like on Mars, obviously, for sure. These are kind of cactus-like things. It's kind of dry and cold, and probably only growing is done in the summer, kind of like in Alaska or whatever. Pine trees, like objects, vegetation. Here's kind of cactus-like vegetation. And certainly evidence of deep gullies and so on made by water traveling across the countryside. There's a lot of evidence of water and even floods on Mars. Joe Skipper sent me this particular object, which is kind of interesting, that he feels that there's a dome, a glass dome, over this picture. I don't personally see the dome, but there's some reflections that he sees that might indicate a dome. And he has much better quality images than we have looking here. in the millions of pixels and so on, and that consequently you can pick up a lot more than we can. But you get the general idea that there's a dome with a very brightly lighted interior. It appears that there's a lot of mining going on Mars. We don't know if that's done by Martians or aliens, or if we're going there and doing it. But in any case, somebody's there doing it. Here's another mining manufacturing plant, which is right near the equator on Mars. And obviously it's warmer on the equator, so you have a better ability to mine and dig into the soil and so forth. There's a lot of, sounds funny, but rust on Mars. That's why it's kind of red. The oxygen created rust through the air, through thousands of years, and the land looks rusty, frankly. But there are plenty of various kinds of minerals on Mars that it would be worth mining. Here's another parent plant, and I don't know if you can see this area up here, but this looks like a gun is spraying water, or possibly used in gold mining. We don't know what the liquid is, but it's being sprayed out rather far distance. This is like a mile or so. Now, one NASA scientist, Dr. Joy Crisp from Princeton University, feels that there probably has been life on Mars. So not all scientists agree with each other. And frankly, a lot of scientists are starting to go along with our concept that there is life. Here's some odd-looking parallel structures on Mars, bridge-like structure. In nature, you don't normally see this kind of a situation. And here's something odd, a radome. I don't know if it has radar in it, but it is a radome on Mars that looks like it was made by Martians or aliens or whatever. Now there's another, you might call, famous city besides Cydonia. There's Elysium, and it has faces as well, and pyramids and a sphinx and writing. Again, you see that letter Y. There's some belief that the Y means God, but we don't know that as a fact, but that's supposition. Landing pad and so on. Again, the area may just be old, or it was actually damaged in a nuclear war or whatever. This is a close-up again by European Space Agency, and it shows some of the pyramids. One of the reasons to have pyramids is if you're getting hit by meteorites, they tend to bounce off the meteor. So in any case, they have a purpose, as well as looking nice, that kind of thing. And we don't know exactly why the Martians decided to build pyramids, but they may have brought that expertise here.